The SEAL team had been trying for 3 hours. 8 shooters, 4 spotters, every piece of advanced technology the U.S. military could provide. The best long-range marksmen in Naval Special Warfare, men who'd made shots that had earned them classified decorations and unclassified respect. They'd fired 37 rounds at a target 2,400 meters away, nearly a mile and a half, across a valley in the Balkans where wind currents moved like living things and temperature gradients shifted every 10 minutes. 37 shots, 37 misses. That's when the Intelligence Support Activity Liaison stepped forward. She was wearing MultiCam fatigues that didn't quite fit right, carrying a rifle case that looked too heavy for her frame, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet enough that most of the frustrated SEALs barely heard her. "I can make that shot." They laughed. Some of them actually laughed. But before we show you what happened when Reagan Foster proved that the impossible was just a matter of understanding physics better than everyone else in the valley, drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Because what you're about to witness isn't just about marksmanship. The Balkans in late autumn were brutally beautiful. Mountains rose like broken teeth against a sky that couldn't decide between gray and darker gray. The SEAL Task Force had been operating in this region for 6 weeks, tracking a warlord whose activities had destabilized 3 countries and killed enough civilians to earn him a spot on every international wanted list that mattered. Intelligence had finally pinpointed his location, a fortified compound on the far side of a valley that was exactly 2,387 meters from the nearest feasible observation position. 2,387 meters, 1.48 miles. The kind of distance where bullets spent so much time in flight that the Earth's rotation became a factor in trajectory calculations, where wind could change direction 3 times during a bullet's journey, where temperature at the muzzle had almost nothing to do with temperature at the target. The SEAL team had set up their shooting position on a rocky outcrop that provided clear line of sight across the valley. They'd brought the best equipment available: Barrett M82A1 1.50 caliber rifles, Schmidt and Bender optics that cost more than luxury cars, Kestrel weather stations that measured atmospheric conditions with laboratory precision, laser rangefinders accurate to within a meter at maximum range. And they had shooters, 8 of them representing decades of combined sniper experience. Master Chief Decker, who'd made confirmed kills at ranges exceeding 1,800 meters in Iraq. Petty Officer Hayes, who'd been an instructor at the Naval Special Warfare Scout Sniper course. Chief Martinez, who'd competed in international long-range shooting competitions before joining the teams. These weren't amateurs. These were professionals who'd spent years perfecting their craft. But this valley was eating them alive. The first shots had been optimistic. Calculated drops, wind calls based on the best data available, proper breathing technique, perfect trigger control. The rounds had arced away into the distance and missed, high and left. They'd adjusted, compensated, recalculated, missed again, low and right this time. The valley's atmospheric conditions were chaotic, refusing to follow predictable patterns. Lieutenant Commander Stevens, the task force leader, was coordinating with higher command via satellite radio when Reagan Foster approached. She'd been attached to the task force as an intelligence support activity liaison, someone who was supposed to provide analysis and coordinate information flow between various agencies. For 3 weeks, she'd been nearly invisible, quiet, professional, doing her job without drawing attention. Now she was standing at the shooting position with a rifle case that definitely hadn't been part of her official equipment manifest. "Ma'am," Master Chief Decker said, not quite hiding his irritation at the interruption, "we're kind of busy here." "I can see that," Foster replied. She was 31, average height, athletic build that suggested regular PT but nothing extraordinary. Brown hair pulled back in a regulation bun, face that you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting her. The kind of person who'd perfected the art of being overlooked. "You've been busy for 3 hours, firing at a target that's relocating in," she checked her watch, 5 hours and 43 minutes. "We're aware of the timeline," Decker said through gritted teeth. "If you've got suggestions on atmospheric modeling or ballistic calculations, we're all ears. Otherwise, I can make that shot." The activity around the shooting position stopped. SEALs who'd been studying wind data, adjusting scopes, or discussing trajectory calculations, turned to look at the ISA liaison, who just claimed she could do what 8 elite snipers had been failing to accomplish for the past 3 hours. "Ma'am," Hayes said carefully, "with all due respect, this isn't a qualification range. The conditions out here are—" "Chaotic," Foster interrupted, "multiple thermal layers creating unpredictable wind currents. Temperature gradient of approximately 15 degrees between our position and the target elevation. Coriolis effect significant at this range and latitude, barometric pressure transitioning as a weather system moves through." "I know. I've been watching you try to solve this problem with technology and conventional ballistic calculations." She set her rifle case down and opened it with practiced movements. Inside was a weapon that made several of the SEALs raise their eyebrows. A Macmillan TAC 50.50 caliber rifle, heavily modified with custom components that suggested someone had invested serious time and money into optimizing this particular weapon system. "Where'd you get that?" Martinez asked, professional interest overriding his skepticism. "Built it myself over the course of 3 years, Foster replied, lifting the rifle out of its case. "Custom barrel from Bartlett, trigger work by Accuracy International's lead gunsmith, stock modified for my specific body mechanics. This rifle has made shots at ranges exceeding 2,800 meters under controlled conditions." Lieutenant Commander Stevens had finished his radio call and walked over to see what was causing the commotion. "Ms. Foster, I wasn't aware you had long-range shooting experience." "You weren't supposed to be aware," Foster said simply. "My primary function here is intelligence liaison. But before I was ISA, I was Army Marksmanship Unit. Before that, competitive long-range shooting at the international level. And before that," she paused, seeming to decide how much to reveal, "other things that aren't in my official biography." Stevens studied her with the intensity of someone who'd learned to read people in high-stress situations. Something about her demeanor, the quiet confidence, the way she handled the rifle like it was an extension of her body, suggested this wasn't bravado. This was someone who knew exactly what she was capable of. "You think you can make a shot my best shooters can't make," Stevens said. It wasn't quite a question. "I don't think. I know." Foster was assembling her rifle with movements that spoke of thousands of repetitions. "Your shooters are excellent, but they're trying to solve this problem with mathematics and technology. This valley requires intuition that comes from understanding atmospheric physics at a level that can't be taught from textbooks." Decker's jaw was tight. "Ma'am, I've been shooting long range for 15 years. I've made kills in every environment from Arctic to desert. What makes you think you understand this valley better than—" "Because I've been watching it for 3 hours while you've been shooting at it," Foster interrupted, not unkindly. "Watch and learn, or don't watch. Either way, that target is relocating in 5 hours and you need a solution." She moved to the shooting position, settling into a prone stance with the kind of body mechanics that made it clear this wasn't her first time behind a precision rifle. The TAC 50 came up to her shoulder like it had been designed specifically for her, which it basically had been. "I need complete silence," she said quietly. "No talking, no movement near my position, and I need 30 minutes to study conditions before I take the shot." Stevens made a decision that would either validate or destroy his career, depending on what happened in the next half hour. Everyone maintained positions, but cease fire. Ms. Foster has the range. The SEALs exchanged glances that ranged from skeptical to openly hostile. 3 hours of frustration, and now some ISA liaison was claiming she could solve their problem. But Stevens had given the order, and SEALs followed orders even when they disagreed with them. Foster ignored the politics and focused on the valley. The study. What happened over the next 30 minutes looked like nothing to the casual observer. Foster laid behind her rifle, eye to scope, barely moving. Occasionally she'd lift her head and observe the valley through a compact spotting scope. Sometimes she'd write numbers in a small notebook. Mostly, she just watched. But what she was doing was anything but simple. Foster was reading the valley the way a master musician reads a score, seeing patterns that weren't visible to conventional observation. She watched how trees bent in different locations, how the pattern changed elevation by elevation. She studied dust devils forming and dissipating, tracking how they moved and what that revealed about ground-level wind currents. She observed how heat shimmer patterns shifted, indicating temperature layers at different altitudes. Every few minutes, she'd pull out a small handheld anemometer and take wind readings at slightly different positions around the shooting area. She was mapping the three-dimensional flow of air, understanding how it moved not just horizontally but vertically, how temperature differences created pressure gradients that pushed air in counterintuitive directions. Through her scope, she watched the target compound with patient intensity. The warlord appeared periodically, moving between buildings, talking to his security detail. She noted his patterns, calculated his likely positions over the next several hours, identified the moment when his position and atmospheric conditions would align for an optimal shot. She wasn't just measuring conditions, she was understanding them, feeling them, building a complete four-dimensional model of the atmosphere her bullet would travel through, accounting not just for where air was moving now, but where it would be moving 7 seconds from now when her bullet reached each point along its trajectory. The SEALs watched with increasing interest. Hayes pulled out his own spotting scope and tried to see what she was seeing. After 10 minutes, he gave up, unable to discern whatever patterns Foster was tracking. Martinez was studying her technique with professional fascination. The way she'd position herself, take a reading, move 3 feet left and take another reading. The way she'd observe distant terrain features and scribble calculations that looked more like fluid dynamics equations than standard ballistic tables. "She's mapping atmospheric layers," Martinez whispered to Hayes, "not just measuring wind speed, but tracking how different pressure systems interact at different elevations. That's graduate-level meteorology applied to ballistics." At the 20-minute mark, Foster pulled out a weather meter and took readings at multiple elevations around their position, climbing to higher ground and lower ground to measure atmospheric gradients. She was breathing steadily, completely focused, existing in a state of concentration that shut out everything except the problem she was solving. She returned to her primary shooting position and began making adjustments to her scope. The numbers she was dialing in looked wrong to anyone watching. Too much elevation compensation, wind adjustment in a direction that seemed opposite to what the Kestrel stations were indicating. But Foster wasn't shooting for where conditions were now. She was shooting for where they would be in 7.3 seconds, during every microsecond of her bullet's flight through air that was moving and changing like a living organism. At 28 minutes, she settled into her final shooting position. Her breathing slowed visibly. Her body relaxed into perfect stillness, the kind of relaxation that required years of training to achieve under stress. Her right hand found the rifle's grip with practiced familiarity, finger resting on the trigger with exactly calibrated pressure. "Target is in optimal position," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "Probability window opens in 60 seconds. I'm taking the shot." Stevens moved to a position where he could observe through a spotting scope. The high-value target was visible in the compound courtyard, talking to subordinates, completely unaware that a bullet was about to travel nearly 1.5 miles to reach him. Decker positioned himself with another spotting scope, ready to call the miss. He was certain it would miss. Everyone missed in these conditions. 37 attempts had proven that. But he was professional enough to hope he was wrong, to hope this woman who'd appeared out of nowhere actually knew something they didn't. Foster's breathing became imperceptible. Her body achieved that perfect stillness that separated master shooters from merely good ones. The rifle became part of her, connected through contact points that had been refined through thousands of hours of practice. She was aware of her heartbeat, timing her shot for the pause between beats when her body was most stable. She was waiting for something only she could sense, a moment when atmospheric conditions throughout the valley aligned into a configuration that would allow her bullet to travel that impossible distance and arrive exactly where she'd calculated. The wind at their position was blowing left to right at 4 miles per hour. But Foster knew that at 800 meters downrange, it would be blowing right to left at 7 miles per hour. At 1,600 meters, it would shift again, pushed by thermal currents rising from the valley floor. And in the final 400 meters before target, yet another pattern would dominate, influenced by the compound's buildings and the terrain features surrounding it. She'd mapped all of it, calculated all of it, and now she was waiting for the precise moment when her bullet could thread through that chaotic atmospheric maze and find its target. 30 seconds, 20 seconds, 10 seconds. Then, in a moment that would be debated and analyzed for years afterward, she fired. The TAC-50 roared like controlled thunder. The recoil was massive. 50 caliber rounds didn't play games, but Foster's body positioning was so perfect that the rifle tracked straight back without disturbing her alignment. The suppressor reduced the acoustic signature, but couldn't eliminate the fundamental violence of propelling a 750 grain bullet at 2,800 feet per second. The bullet left the muzzle and began its journey through an atmosphere that wanted to push it off course in a dozen different directions. At 0.2 seconds, the bullet was traveling through their immediate positions 4 miles per hour left to right wind, being pushed fractionally off its bore axis. At 1.1 seconds, it crossed into a thermal layer where rising air from the valley floor created upward pressure that lifted the bullet slightly higher than ballistic calculations would predict. At 2.4 seconds, it encountered the 7 mile per hour right-to-left wind that Foster had identified, being pushed back toward centerline in a correction that looked like luck, but was actually precise calculation. At 3.8 seconds, the bullet reached its apex, nearly 280 feet above the target elevation, before beginning its descent back toward Earth, now moving through cooler air that was denser, affecting its velocity and trajectory in ways that required quantum-level physics to fully understand. At 5.2 seconds, crosswinds from the valley's eastern ridge pushed the bullet left, but Foster had anticipated this, building the correction into her aim point 2 minutes before taking the shot. At 6.5 seconds, the bullet was descending through the final atmospheric layer, affected by ground-level winds that swirled around the compound's buildings in patterns that changed every few minutes. At 7.28 seconds, the bullet arrived. The SEALs watched through scopes, tracking the target, waiting to see where the round would impact. Most were expecting another miss, high, low, left, right, somewhere in the general vicinity but not on target. 7 seconds was an eternity in ballistics. Too many variables, too much chaos, too much distance for any human to accurately calculate. But Foster wasn't any human. The high-value target collapsed like someone had cut his strings. One moment he was standing in the compound courtyard, talking to his security chief, gesturing toward the mountains. The next moment there was a spray of red mist where his head had been, and his body was falling, dead before it hit the ground. 7.28 seconds of flight time. 2,387 meters of distance, through atmospheric conditions that had defeated 37 previous attempts by the best shooters Naval Special Warfare could provide. 1 shot, 1 kill, first-round impact. The compound erupted into chaos. Men scattered like insects, searching for cover, shouting orders, trying to identify where death had come from. Security personnel rushed to their fallen leader, but anyone with medical training could see it was pointless. The shot had been instantly fatal, precise beyond what should have been possible at that range. Decker lowered his spotting scope slowly, his face showing an expression somewhere between shock and awe. "Holy Mother of God," he breathed. She did it. First fucking round. Hayes was shaking his head, unable to process what he'd just witnessed. That's not possible. The wind data alone should have made that shot impossible. How did she didn't use our wind data, Martinez interrupted, his voice carrying a respect that bordered on reverence. She built her own atmospheric model, mapped the entire valley's air movement patterns, calculated where winds would be during each second of bullet flight, not just where they are now. Stevens was on the radio, confirming the kill with overhead surveillance assets that had been monitoring the compound. The target was definitely down, definitely dead, and the mission that had been consuming resources for 3 months was suddenly complete. Foster was already breaking down her rifle with the same methodical precision she'd used to assemble it. She showed no excitement, no triumph, just the professional satisfaction of someone who'd solved a difficult problem correctly. Her hands moved through the disassembly sequence automatically, muscle memory handling the mechanical task, while her mind was already moving on to the next requirement. "Ms. Foster," Stevens said, ending his radio call and approaching the shooting position. That was the most impressive piece of marksmanship I've seen in 23 years of service. Thank you, sir, Foster replied, securing her rifle in its case. The conditions were actually more stable than they initially appeared. Once I mapped the pressure gradients and thermal layers, the solution became relatively straightforward. Relatively straightforward, Decker repeated, his tone suggesting he wasn't sure whether to be impressed or insulted. Ma'am, I've been shooting long range my entire adult life. What you just did isn't relatively straightforward. That's borderline miraculous. Foster looked up from her rifle case, meeting Decker's eyes with an expression that was patient but firm. Master Chief, miracles are what people call expertise they don't understand. What I did was apply atmospheric physics and ballistic calculations at a level beyond what standard military training provides. It looks like magic because you haven't been trained to see the patterns I'm seeing. She stood, slinging her rifle case over her shoulder. Your 37 attempts weren't failures. They were data points that confirmed the valley's atmospheric behavior matched my theoretical models. Every one of your shots taught me something about how air was moving through this terrain. You did the groundwork. I just came in with a different analytical framework. It was a diplomatic way of saying she'd watched them fail for 3 hours and used their failures as scientific data to refine her own calculations. Some of the SEALs bristled at the implication, but most recognized it for what it was: truth delivered without malice. Walk me through it, Martinez said suddenly. The whole calculation process. I want to understand how you modeled atmospheric conditions at that level of detail. Foster hesitated, then seemed to decide that sharing knowledge was worth the time investment. She pulled out her notebook and began explaining her methodology, using diagrams and equations that made Martinez's eyes widen with each page. You're using Navier-Stokes equations for fluid dynamics, Martinez said, tracing one of the calculations, applied to air movement through complex terrain. That's computational fluid dynamics at a level that usually requires supercomputers, or 8 years of practice building the intuition to approximate computational solutions in real time, Foster replied. I can't run the full calculations in my head, but I can recognize patterns that indicate specific atmospheric behaviors. Then I apply simplified models that get me close enough for a practical shooting solution. She flipped through several more pages, showing how she'd broken down the valley into atmospheric zones, calculated pressure differentials between zones, predicted how those differentials would evolve over time, and finally integrated all of that into a ballistic solution that accounted for bullet position at each fraction of a second during its flight. This is PhD-level physics, Martinez said quietly. Where did you learn this? MIT, Foster said simply. Doctorate in atmospheric physics with a focus on predictive modeling of chaotic air systems. Got recruited by Army Marksmanship Unit because someone in procurement thought my research might have military applications. Turns out they were right. Stevens was putting pieces together. ISA recruited specialists with unique capabilities that conventional military units lacked. Foster's official role was intelligence liaison, but her actual value was as someone who could solve problems that existed at the intersection of multiple highly technical disciplines. The compound is locked down, Stevens said, checking his tablet. Local authorities are coordinating target confirmation and site exploitation. We'll need to withdraw to our secondary position before enemy forces can organize a response. The team began packing equipment with practiced efficiency. Foster helped secure gear, moving through the tactical space like she'd been part of the unit for years rather than weeks. Her role might be intelligence liaison, but she understood operational security and field discipline like someone with extensive ground combat experience. As they moved out, following exfiltration routes that had been planned days earlier, Hayes fell into step beside Foster. Ma'am, can I ask you something? Of course. That shot. Was it really straightforward once you'd mapped the atmosphere, or were you just being modest? Foster considered the question as they navigated rocky terrain that would take them to their extraction point. Honestly, it was about 70% calculation and 30% educated guess. At that range, in those conditions, you can never account for every variable. But if you understand the major patterns well enough, you can make guesses that are more likely to be right than wrong. Today, my guess was correct. 70-30, Hayes repeated. Most shooters would never take a shot with a 30% uncertainty factor. Most shooters have alternatives, Foster replied. You had 37 attempts to refine your approach. I had one shot, one opportunity. In that situation, 70-30 odds are better than the mission failing, so you take the shot and trust your training. It was a philosophy that resonated with SEALs, who routinely operated in situations where perfect information was impossible and decisions had to be made with incomplete data. Foster might be ISA, might have a PhD in physics, might operate in the intelligence world more than the tactical one, but she understood the warrior mindset of taking calculated risks when stakes were high. The extraction went smoothly. They reached their rally point, linked up with vehicles that had been pre-positioned, and were back at their forward operating base before the enemy forces in the valley could organize any kind of pursuit. By the time local security services arrived at the compound, the SEAL team was 50 miles away, already beginning the process of mission debrief and equipment maintenance. The mission report was carefully worded. Target eliminated at extended range by task force sniper element, technical details classified, method of engagement classified, contributing personnel classified, the kind of report that would satisfy higher command's need for operational success while protecting capabilities that shouldn't be widely known. But within Naval Special Warfare, the story spread. About the ISA liaison who'd made a shot that 8 SEALs couldn't make. About physics and intuition combining to achieve what technology alone couldn't accomplish. About the quiet professional who'd been hiding world-class capabilities behind a job description that didn't begin to capture her actual value. 3 days after the shot, Stevens found Foster in the Task Force Operations Center, reviewing intelligence reports with the same methodical precision she applied to everything. "We need to talk," he said. 3 days after the shot, Stevens found Foster in the Task Force Operations Center, reviewing intelligence reports with the same methodical precision she applied to everything. "We need to talk," he said. They found privacy in a secure planning room. Stevens pulled out a tablet and showed Foster a message from Naval Special Warfare Command. It was a formal request for her temporary assignment to train SEAL snipers in advanced atmospheric modeling and extreme-range shooting techniques. "They want you to teach," Stevens said, "to pass on whatever voodoo you used to make that shot." Foster read the message with a neutral expression. "I'm not sure I can teach this. It took me 8 years to get to a point where I could consistently make shots beyond 2,000 meters. That's not a skill set you can compress into a training course." "They're not asking for a training course. They're asking for you to spend 6 months embedded with the sniper community, working alongside instructors, sharing knowledge." Stevens leaned back. "In my 23 years in the teams, I've never seen anyone make a shot like that, first round, under conditions that defeated every technological solution we had. That's capability the military needs to understand and replicate if possible." "And if it's not possible to replicate?" Foster asked quietly. "Then at least we'll have you. Someone we can call when conventional solutions fail." Stevens met her eyes. That shot saved 3 months of operational planning and probably saved lives by removing a target who was destabilizing an entire region. That's value that transcends job descriptions and organizational charts. Foster considered this. Part of her wanted to decline, to maintain the low profile that had served her well throughout her career. But another part, the part that had spent 8 years obsessively pursuing perfection in long-range shooting, recognized an opportunity to share knowledge that might save lives. 6 months, she said finally. "But I maintain my ISA duties and can be pulled for operational requirements, and the training stays classified. I don't want my techniques becoming public knowledge." "Agreed." Stevens extended his hand. "Welcome to the community, Ms. Foster." Officially. Over the following 6 months, Reagan Foster became something of a legend within special operations circles. She worked with SEAL snipers, Army Special Forces marksmen, Marine Scout snipers, and Air Force Special Operations personnel, teaching advanced atmospheric modeling that went far beyond standard ballistic calculations. Her classes were small, never more than 8 students at a time, and highly selective. She required students to have advanced mathematics backgrounds, preferably with coursework in fluid dynamics or atmospheric physics. The washout rate was high. Many students could follow the theory, but couldn't develop the intuitive feel for atmospheric patterns that real-world application required. But those who succeeded gained capabilities that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible in long-range precision shooting. They learned to read terrain like a 3-dimensional atmospheric map, to recognize patterns in how air moved that were invisible to instruments, to calculate ballistic solutions that accounted for air as a dynamic, changing medium rather than a static variable. Foster didn't just teach mathematics, she taught a way of seeing, a way of understanding that the atmosphere was alive, that it moved and breathed and created opportunities for those patient enough to wait for the right moment. That at extreme ranges, shooting became less about technology and more about developing senses that most people didn't know existed. The rifle is just a tool, she told her students during one particularly challenging session in the Montana mountains. The scope, the rangefinder, the ballistic computer, all tools. What matters is the meat computer behind the optic. Your brain. Your ability to process information faster than technology can measure it. That's what separates good long-range shooters from the ones who can make shots that look impossible. She'd take them to challenging environments, mountains, deserts, coastal areas where marine layers created atmospheric chaos, and make them attempt shots that conventional wisdom said were impossible. Then, she'd show them how to break down the problem, how to identify patterns, how to build mental models that turned chaos into something understandable. Not everyone could learn what she taught. Some students had the mathematics, but lacked the spatial reasoning to build 3-dimensional atmospheric models in their heads. Others had natural shooting talent, but couldn't grasp the underlying physics that explained why certain techniques worked. But a few, maybe 1 in 20, grasped it, found that place where training and talent combined to create something beyond either component. Those few became the military's answer to problems that required eliminating threats at ranges that shouldn't be possible. Martinez was one of them. The SEAL chief had the right combination of competitive shooting background, mathematical aptitude, and dedication to master Foster's techniques. By the end of 6 months, he'd made confirmed hits at ranges exceeding 2,200 meters under field conditions that would have defeated him before the training. "You gave me a new way of seeing," Martinez told Foster during their final training session. "I thought I understood long-range shooting, but you showed me I was only seeing 2 dimensions when the real problem exists in 4 dimensions. Time matters as much as space. Predicting where conditions will be matters more than measuring where they are now." Foster nodded, pleased that at least some of her students had internalized the core concepts. Remember that technology is a crutch. Use it for baseline data, but don't trust it at extreme ranges. Trust your training. Trust your ability to read what the atmosphere is telling you. The wind doesn't lie if you know how to listen. The shot in the Balkans remained classified, but it became the standard that others measured themselves against. 2,387 meters, first-round hit under impossible conditions, the benchmark for what could be achieved when capability exceeded expectation. Foster returned to her ISA duties after 6 months, fading back into the background role that let her operate without attracting attention. But she'd left her mark on the special operations community. Her students went on to make shots that would have been impossible before their training. And when truly impossible shots were required, when conventional solutions had failed and someone needed to do the impossible, her name came up in classified planning sessions. Because sometimes solving impossible problems required someone who understood that impossible was just a word people used when they hadn't found the right approach yet. And Reagan Foster had spent her career finding approaches that conventional wisdom said didn't exist. 5 years later, the request came through encrypted channels, routed through command structures that existed in bureaucratic shadows. An emerging situation in the Middle East. A target at extreme range, conditions that defeated every shooting solution conventional snipers could develop, and a timeline measured in hours rather than days. Foster read the operational brief with professional detachment. She'd made hundreds of shots since that day in the Balkans, though none had required quite the same combination of distance and chaos. She'd continued refining her understanding of atmospheric physics, incorporating new research, developing predictive models that pushed the boundaries of what was calculable. The target was 2,647 meters away, nearly 1.65 miles, through terrain that made the Balkans look simple by comparison. Desert heat shimmer that created optical chaos, unpredictable wind patterns caused by temperature extremes. The kind of shot that would require everything she'd learned over 15 years of obsessive practice. She packed her custom TAC-50, the rifle that had become extension of her body through thousands of hours of training. She updated her atmospheric modeling software with the latest meteorological data from the target region. She reviewed satellite imagery, building mental maps of terrain features that would affect air movement. She sent back a single-word reply: approved. 24 hours later, she was in position on a ridgeline overlooking a compound where a terrorist leader had taken refuge. The local SEAL team had been attempting the shot for 6 hours, 12 shooters, 43 attempts, 0 hits. Foster spent 90 minutes studying the environment. The desert atmosphere was even more chaotic than the Balkans had been. Heat created convection currents that pushed air in violent, unpredictable patterns. Dust devils formed and dissipated without warning. Mirages made distance estimation nearly impossible using conventional methods. But Foster didn't use conventional methods. She mapped the chaos, found patterns in what looked like randomness, identified the rhythm of how heat moved through the valley, how it created pressure gradients, how those gradients pushed air in ways that instruments couldn't measure, but trained observation could detect. When she finally took the shot, it was with the same quiet confidence she'd shown 5 years earlier in the Balkans. The bullet traveled for 8.1 seconds through atmosphere that wanted to push it off course in a dozen different directions. It threaded through thermal layers, fought against crosswinds, compensated for pressure differentials that changed microsecond by microsecond, and it arrived exactly where Foster had calculated it would. The target dropped. Mission complete. Another impossible shot made possible through expertise that existed at the intersection of physics, mathematics, and intuition, developed through years of dedicated practice. The SEALs watching through spotting scopes were silent for a long moment. Then one of them, a young sniper who'd been trying unsuccessfully for hours, spoke quietly into the silence. How does she do that? His team leader, a veteran who'd been around long enough to know the answer, replied with simple truth: because she's Reagan Foster. And for her, impossible is just physics that other people don't understand yet. Reagan Foster continued her work as an ISA liaison, moving through military organizations with the quiet professionalism that had characterized her entire career. Most people she worked with never knew about her capabilities. She was just another intelligence specialist doing her job, filing reports, coordinating information flow. But somewhere in classified files, her name appeared on a very short list. People to call when conventional solutions had failed, when targets needed to be eliminated at ranges that defeated standard sniper doctrine, when atmospheric conditions were too chaotic for technology-based solutions. The wolf doesn't announce itself to the sheep. It waits patiently, watching, learning, understanding terrain and conditions that others merely observe. And when the moment comes, when distance and chaos conspire to create impossible problems, the wolf makes the shot that everyone said couldn't be made. Every single time. Because impossible is just a failure of imagination. And Reagan Foster had spent a lifetime imagining solutions that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional wisdom. The SEALs called it impossible at 2,400 meters. She called it physics. And physics didn't care about opinion. It just required understanding. Understanding she possessed in abundance. The kind of understanding that came from 8 years of graduate study, 15 years of practical application, and thousands of shots taken in conditions that would have defeated anyone else. Understanding that turned impossible into inevitable. Every time, without exception, Because that's what mastery looked like when it existed at levels most people couldn't comprehend. Quiet, professional, absolutely lethal. The way it was supposed to be. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring tales of courage.